In the spring of 1293, a sailor climbing the rigging of a Chinese war junk off the coast of Kalimantan looked south and saw something that stopped his breath. Not land, not a storm. Ships, as far as he could see, in every direction, hundreds of them, bristling with soldiers, loaded with siege engines, their dragon banners hanging slack in the equatorial heat. This was the Armada of Kublai Khan, the most powerful man alive, the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in human history. They had sailed 4,000 kilometers from the port of Quanzhou. They had survived a typhoon that sank several of their vessels. They had stopped in Vietnam to resupply, paused off the coast of Borneo to build shallow draft boats for river navigation. And now, at last, they were coming for Java. The admiral leading this fleet was a Uyghur named Ike Mese. He had completed 4 overseas missions for the Khan and had never attempted anything on this scale. He wrote in his log, "The wind was strong and the sea very rough, so that the ships rolled heavily and the soldiers could not eat for many days." What Ike Mese did not write, what he had no way of knowing, was that the king he had been sent to punish was already dead. And that a man without a throne, hiding in a forest with a handful of loyal soldiers, was watching the horizon and quietly calculating the most audacious double cross in the history of Southeast Asia. To understand why 1,000 Mongol warships arrived off the coast of Java, you have to go back 4 years, back to a throne room in a city called Singasari in the eastern highlands of Java, back to a king who had spent 2 decades building something extraordinary, and who, in a single afternoon, set it on fire. His name was Kertanegara, and if you had met him at the height of his power, you would have found a man of remarkable contradictions. He was, by all accounts, physically unimposing, slender, with bright, round eyes and long fingers. But those who worked alongside him described someone who weighed every decision carefully, who had a scholar's interest in ancient scriptures, and who understood instinctively the relationship between spiritual authority and political power. He was also, on occasion, reckless in ways that seem almost deliberately self-destructive. By 1289, Kertanegara had built Singasari into the dominant force in the region. His kingdom controlled not just Java, but Bali, large parts of Sumatra, a territory in Borneo, and a strategic foothold on the Malay Peninsula. He had forged an alliance with the Kingdom of Champa, in what is now southern Vietnam. He had sent military expeditions across the seas and brought them home victorious. When Chinese merchants arrived in the ports of eastern Java, they found a kingdom with the confidence of an empire. He had also been watching the Mongols for years. In 1274, when Kublai Khan sent his fleet against Champa, Kertanegara understood the message. The Khan was moving south, testing the waters, measuring the resistance of the kingdoms that lined the maritime Silk Road between China and the Indian Ocean. The strait between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, the Strait of Malacca, was the choke point through which all of that trade flowed. Control it, and you controlled the wealth of the region. Lose it, and Java's economy would slowly suffocate. So Kertanegara acted. He sent forces to southern Sumatra, secured the Jambi region, placed his own allies in key positions along the strait. He sent a princess to marry a Champa prince, binding the two kingdoms together against a common threat. He was, in his own way, playing the long game. And then Mung Chi arrived. The year was 1289. The Chinese diplomat had sailed from Dadu, the Mongol name for what is now Beijing, with a message that was not really a message so much as an ultimatum. Kertanegara must acknowledge the supremacy of the Yuan dynasty. He must send a member of the royal family to live at the Khan's court as a gesture of submission. He must become a vassal. The audience took place in the palace at Singasari. Kertanegara sat elevated on his throne. Around him were his ministers, his priests, his senior advisors. His 4 daughters were present. So was a young prince named Wijaya, the man who, by all expectation, would one day succeed him. Mung Chi delivered his message. He spoke, as diplomats do, of the Khan's good health and his warm regard for the flourishing kingdom of Singasari. And then he came to the point. What happened next has been debated by historians for 7 centuries. The Yuan dynasty's official history, compiled in 1370, records only that the Javanese cut the face of the imperial envoy. Whether that meant a deliberate mutilation of the nose, a slash across the cheek, a branding, or something less precisely physical, has never been fully resolved. What is not disputed is that Mung Chi left the palace wounded, was placed on a cart, and was sent back to China. The bleeding diplomat who walked into the halls of Dadu and presented himself to Kublai Khan was a message in flesh. And the Khan, who had spent his life being obeyed by everyone from the steppes of Mongolia to the banks of the Danube, understood it perfectly. He summoned his commanders. He gave the order. But here is something that rarely appears in the standard telling of this story. The young prince Wijaya was in that room when it happened. He watched as the guard raised the knife. He watched as Mung Chi was led away. 4 years later, when a Uyghur admiral arrived off the Java coast looking for allies, the local population would carefully omit this detail from everything they told him. The Mongol fleet was still weeks away from Java when the kingdom it had come to punish was destroyed, not from outside, but from within. The man who made it possible was not a general. He was a bureaucrat who felt he had been insulted. His name was Virahraja, and he governed the small island of Mahdura, a narrow strip of land just off Java's northern coast. He had once been a powerful figure at the Singasari court, but years earlier, Kertanegara had appointed him to Madura as a regional governor, a position that, from the outside, looked like a promotion. Virahraja did not see it that way. He saw it as exile. as a way of removing him from the center of power while keeping him too far away to cause trouble. He spent years in that perceived exile, and he remembered every slight. In 1292, he saw his moment. Kertanegara's main army was in Sumatra, securing the southern approaches against the Mongols. Back in Singasari, the city was lightly defended. The old chief minister, a man named Raghunatha, who had been sidelined by younger advisors years earlier, had actually received reports of unusual troop movements nearby and had tried to warn the king. Kertanegara dismissed the concern. His brother-in-law governed Kediri, the rival city to the west. His brother-in-law's son commanded part of the royal army. Everything was under control. What Kertanegara did not know was that Weeraraja had already sent a letter to the governor of Kediri. The letter was deliberately cryptic, but its meaning was clear to anyone who spoke the language of ambition. Master, if you want to go hunting, this is the time. There are no alligators, tigers, wild buffaloes, or snakes or thorns. There is a tiger, but he is toothless. The alligators and buffaloes were the soldiers now deployed in Sumatra. The toothless tiger was the aging, sidelined Raghunatha. It was the most consequential piece of correspondence in Javanese history. The governor of Kediri was a man named Jahyakatwang. His family had ruled this region before Kenarok's dynasty swept them aside 70 years earlier. The memory of that humiliation had been passed down through generations. He called his advisors together, and they devised a plan of elegant simplicity. Split the army in two. Send one force north with banners flying and drums beating, visible, obvious, easily spotted. Draw the king's attention and his soldiers to the wrong threat. Meanwhile, send the real army, 10,000 of Kediri's best men, through the mountains from the south, at night, in silence. The timing was chosen carefully. It would happen on a night when Kertanegara was performing a tantric ritual at his palace. The king was known for these ceremonies, elaborate affairs involving skull cups of palm wine, incantations, and the participation of priests. It was a night when he would be, at least in part, occupied elsewhere. It worked exactly as planned. Kertanegara's guards spotted the northern force early enough, and the king sent Wijaya and 1,000 men to push them back. They succeeded. Wijaya drove the northern Kediri troops all the way to the coast. The revolt appeared to be over almost before it started, but the southern army had been moving through mountain passes all night. While Wijaya was fighting in the north, 10,000 soldiers emerged from the forests south of Singasari and entered a city with almost no one left to defend it. The stonemasons who were working that morning on a new temple just south of the city saw it first, something glinting in the distant rice fields. Armed men moving fast, carrying no banners. By the time the alarm spread through the streets, it was already too late. Kertanegara remained at the center of his ritual as the palace walls were breached. He was, by every account, a man who believed absolutely in the spiritual power he had spent his life cultivating. Skull cup in hand, priests chanting around him, he summoned the forces he had always trusted. The soldiers came through the gates anyway. They pushed the priests aside. They stabbed the king where he sat. The king, who had spent 23 years building the most powerful kingdom in the region, died in the middle of a prayer. Raden Wijaya was returning from the north when the news reached him. Singasari had fallen. The king was dead. 3 of the 4 princesses had been taken hostage, and Adaraja, Jahyakatwang's own son, the man who had been fighting alongside Raden Wijaya just hours before, had switched sides the moment the outcome became clear. For a moment, Raden Wijaya wanted to go back, to salvage something from the ruins of the city he had grown up in, the palace where he had spent his childhood. But there was nothing to go back to. The fire was already spreading. The streets were full of Kadiri soldiers. And Jahyakatwang's general, a man they called Kebo Mundarang, the buffalo, knew exactly who Raden Wijaya was. He was the heir to the throne. He could not be allowed to survive. What followed was a pursuit through paddy fields and forest tracks that very nearly ended the story before it could begin. The buffalo caught up with Raden Wijaya in an old rice field. The men around them fell one by one. The general, spear raised, had Wijaya on the ground, and Wijaya, flailing in the mud, found a fragment of old iron from a broken plough. He slashed upward. The general's eyes caught the edge of the metal. In the confusion that followed, a wounded man, sudden darkness, screaming, Wijaya and his closest companions disappeared into the trees. There were 12 of them. 12 survivors from everything that had been Singasari. His friends Lahwe, Nambi, and Sohra. A handful of soldiers. And discovered almost by accident near a campfire on a forest path that night, Princess Tribuwana, the eldest daughter of Kertanegara, being taken to Kadiri as a hostage, barely guarded in the chaos. They moved through the dark. Coconuts when they could find them. Whatever fruit the forest offered. They climbed toward Mount Semeru, where an old religious hermit named Santa Morti lived in voluntary exile from the court he had once served. He fed them. He gave them shelter. He let them rest. And then he told Wijaya where to go next. The advice was this. Cross to Madura. Seek sanctuary with Wirahraja. Neither Santamurti nor Wijaya knew that Wirahraja was the man who had set this entire catastrophe in motion. As far as they were aware, he was a loyal former court official who had been pushed aside by the same forces that had now destroyed everything they knew. They reached the coast, crossed the narrow strait, and arrived at Wirahraja's palace unexpected and exhausted. Wirahraja welcomed them warmly. He gave them food. He gave them wine. He listened over many long evenings as Wirahraja described everything that had happened. The treachery, the assassination, the flight through the forest, the 12 survivors. Wirahraja's expression throughout all of this was one of shock and outrage. He was, of course, neither shocked nor outraged. He had known. He had arranged it. But a man who has already betrayed 3 parties simultaneously has, by that point, developed a certain fluency with the performance of innocence. And he had a plan. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Wijaya would go to Kadiri. He would walk into the city of the man who had killed the king, surrender himself, and ask for permission to build a new settlement in the forest between Singasari and Kadiri. Once he had land, time, and the appearance of loyalty, anything might become possible. It was, Wiraraja admitted, a position of humiliation. A prince without an army, presenting himself to the man who had just destroyed his world. But Wijaya had no men and no money. He had 12 loyal followers and a borrowed horse. A pauper prince in a jungle was not going to restore a dynasty. Wijaya rode to Kediri. What happened in Kediri over the following weeks reveals something essential about the kind of man Raden Wijaya was. Jaya Katwang, deeply suspicious, agreed to receive him. Partly because Wiraraja, who was still in favor, had vouched for him, and partly because a neutralized prince posed far less of a threat than a prince at large in the jungle. There was a festival, a military tournament. Jaya Katwang, his ego inflated by victory, wanted to display his new vassal publicly, to show his people that the heir of Singasari had come to bow. He staged a mock battle, Kediri against Singasari, a piece of theatre designed to end in the humiliation of the defeated side. Singasari won both rounds. The crowd turned hostile. Jaya Katwang, standing before thousands of his own people, had just watched his propaganda collapse in real time. And then Wijaya stood up, the man who was supposed to be humiliated, and addressed the crowd. Clearly, the men of Kediri let their guests win, as a good host would do. It shows the greatness of King Jaya Katwang. The crowd cheered. Jaya Katwang smiled. It was one of the most graceful acts of political manipulation ever performed in public, and it cost Wijaya nothing but the words. A few weeks later, Wijaya approached Jaya Katwang with a request. He needed a place to live. Not Singasari, that was clearly impossible. There was a stretch of forest between the two cities, near a place called Trik, close to the sacred cemetery at Wurare. Would the king permit him to settle there with his men? Jaya Katwang agreed, with one condition. Wijaya's men could go, but Wijaya himself had to remain in Kediri, under watch. And so the men rode out to the forest of Trik and began to cut trees. They built houses. They built a small audience hall. Wiraraja sent workers from Mahdura to help. The settlement grew quietly, out of sight, out of the capital's immediate attention. One afternoon, one of the men put down his axe and reached for a fruit that had fallen from a nearby tree. He bit into it and immediately spat it out, his face contracted with disgust. Heat. Bitter. Someone laughed and said the whole forest was full of these trees, mahjar trees, full of bitter mahjar fruit. The joke spread through the camp. They called the new settlement Mahjar Heat. Bitter mahjar. The name stuck, and it would echo through the next 2 centuries of Southeast Asian history. Under the pretext of inspecting the construction, Wijaya eventually rode out to the settlement himself. He found it transformed. The word had spread that he was back, that the prince was building something. Supporters had begun arriving from nearby villages. What had been 12 men fleeing through a forest was becoming, slowly, something that resembled a court. Wijaya gave each of his original companions a formal title. He had someone build a throne, white stone, raised on a dais. He sat in it. A few weeks later, an enormous Mongol fleet arrived off the coast of Java. Admiral Ike Mese arrived at the port of Tuban in late March 1293, after 3 months at sea. His ships, war junks drawing up to 15 meters of water, were too deep for the harbor. He had to commandeer small boats to ferry his soldiers ashore. From the moment he landed, he was operating in an environment he did not understand. He sent the Office of Pacification, a small delegation of officials, into the interior with a message for the king. And he waited. The reply, when it came, was not what he expected. The king he had been sent to punish was dead. His capital was in ruins. A man named Jahya Katwang now ruled Java from a city called Kediri, on the far side of the mountains. Ike Mese convened with his 2 commanders, Shibi, a Mongol, and Gaoxing, who was Chinese, and tried to think through the situation. The expedition's entire purpose had been to punish Kertanegara for his treatment of Meng Qi. Kertanegara no longer existed. Kediri had committed no offense against the Khan. The legal and political justification for the invasion had evaporated. And then a message arrived from a place called Majapahit. A prince, a man calling himself Raden Wijaya, the legitimate heir to the throne of Singasari, had gathered a force in the forest. He was offering to submit to Kublai Khan if the admirals would help him crush the rebel Jaya Katwang. He would provide them with maps of the interior. He would supply local intelligence and armed support. He would declare himself a vassal of the Yuan dynasty, and the princesses currently held prisoner in Kediri would accompany the fleet back to China as a tribute to the great Khan. The admirals did their due diligence. They questioned members of the local population. Every person they asked confirmed that Wijaya was indeed the legitimate heir, that Jaya Katwang was widely despised, and that the prince was popular among the people of eastern Java. There was one piece of information that nobody chose to volunteer. One small detail that every person in that region knew perfectly well, that 4 years earlier, this same prince had been present in the throne room when Meng Qi's face was mutilated. That the insult which had brought the entire Mongol fleet to their shores had been ordered by the king, yes, but witnessed by this man. And that the admirals were, at this very moment, being invited to trust him. Nobody said a word. The alliance was struck. Smaller vessels sailed upriver to Majapahit to meet Wijaya in person. The admiral found him intelligent and composed, a born leader, someone the commanders could work with. Weera Raja was also present, older and more experienced, radiating the calm authority of a man who had been double-crossing powerful people his entire life. The combined army that marched on Kediri was something the region had never seen. Tens of thousands of soldiers, Mongol horsemen, Chinese infantry, Javanese fighters, Maduran troops under Weera Raja, war elephants, ox carts loaded with medical supplies, siege engines that had been disassembled on the ships and reassembled on land, catapults that could hurl boulders through palace walls. A weapon completely new to the Javanese, the Chinese Ta-Pao, grenades launched from catapults. They advanced along the Brantas River toward Kediri, staying close to the water's edge to avoid the dense forests further inland. The battle was fierce. Kediri's army fought under its red and white banners, led by the same general, Kebo Mundarang, the buffalo, who had nearly killed Wijaya in a muddy field the previous year. His forces were dug in and well prepared. For days, the fighting ebbed and flowed, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. A ceasefire was called to recover the dead. When the fighting resumed, the smaller and exhausted Kediri forces began to break. Jayakatwang's end is recorded differently in different sources. The Chinese accounts are terse. He surrendered, was taken prisoner along with his family and officers. The Javanese accounts are richer, and one of them is extraordinary. The king, they say, sat atop his war elephant as his lines collapsed around him, folded his hands together, entered a deep state of meditation, and vanished into the heavens. His soldiers, witnessing this transcendence, were so inspired that they continued to fight to the last man. Whatever actually happened to Jayakatwang, the city of Kediri fell. The palace was ransacked. 500,000 taels of silver were discovered in the treasury. Most of it the wealth that Jayakatwang himself had looted from Singasari the year before. The money changed hands for the third time. The mood after the battle should have been uncomplicated. The enemy was defeated. The loot was enormous. The alliance had worked exactly as planned. But then came the question of the princesses. Wijaya ordered the Singasari princesses, Kertanegara's 4 daughters, 3 of whom had been held hostage in Kediri, to be escorted back to Majapahit. The Chinese commanders interrupted. The deal, they reminded him, had included the princesses traveling back to China as tribute to the great Khan. Wijaya said there had been a misunderstanding. The agreement referred to the Kediri royal princesses. Those women were unfortunately no longer available, having recently died. The Singasari princesses were a different matter entirely. He did not mention that one of those princesses was his fiancée. Tempers rose. The situation was edging toward violence. And then Veera Raja, the architect of the entire enterprise, the man who had betrayed more people in the last 2 years than most people meet in a lifetime, stepped in with his diplomatic skills. He proposed a solution. These matters could be resolved after the coronation. Let Prince Wijaya be crowned king in Majapahit and formally declare himself a vassal of the Khan. Then everything could be discussed in an orderly fashion. The admirals grudgingly agreed. They would send 200 soldiers to escort the princesses and accompany the prince to the coronation. After that, they would sail for home. What happened next required precise timing, reliable intelligence, and a working knowledge of human nature, specifically the nature of soldiers who have survived a typhoon, a 3-month ocean crossing, and a pitched battle in a tropical country they don't understand, and who are now being offered unlimited roasted goat, local music, and palm wine. The 200 Chinese soldiers assigned to guard the Singasari princesses did not need much encouragement to join the celebration in Majapahit that night. The main army was at the coast, loading the silver onto the ships, counting its winnings. Here in the forest settlement, fires burned, food was everywhere, and local women danced at the edge of the firelight. The soldiers had earned this. They had been at sea for months. They had won. They did not notice that Wijaya's closest soldiers were not drinking. The sign was given. The 200 soldiers, most of them drunk, none of them expecting it, were killed almost where they sat. One of the Chinese commanders managed to escape with a handful of men and reached the main camp at the coast. The news spread through the fleet. They had been betrayed. 3,000 soldiers had died taking Kadiri. Many more were wounded. Their allies had turned on them. They were deep in a hostile island, far from supply lines, in a forest they could not navigate, with a monsoon change coming that would leave them stranded for another 6 months. The Admiral Gaoxing, the one who had warned against leaving only 200 men at Majapahit, had been right all along. The Khan would have to reckon with that later. For now, there was only one decision that made sense. The admirals convened. They counted what they had: the silver, the spices, the fabrics, enough wealth to soften the blow of the failure when they reported back to Dadu. And they gave the order: load the ships, raise the anchors, sail for home. In early November 1293, 1 full year after departing China, the fleet that had come to conquer Java turned north and disappeared over the horizon. Back in Peking, the 2 senior admirals were punished for the failure. Admiral Gaoxing received 50 taels of gold for having been correct. Kublai Khan, who was old and ill and struggling with gout, received the news of his fleet's humiliation and did not order a second expedition. On February 18, 1294, he died at the age of 79. The next Khan had different problems. The threat to Java faded and was never renewed. The Mongol Empire, which had subdued China, shattered the Abbasid Caliphate, and brought Eastern Europe to its knees, had been outmaneuvered by a man who, 14 months earlier, had been hiding in a forest with 12 companions and no army. Majapahit, November 1293. The streets were full of builders finishing pavilions. Children tied colourful banners to doorposts and trees. Court officials argued over the precise blend of cow dung, red andong blossom and lotus flowers used to decorate the ceremonial walls. A detail that appears in the historical sources with the specificity that suggests these things genuinely mattered to the people involved. The hermit Santa Murti had come down from his mountain retreat on Mount Semeharu to preside. He was the man who had given Wijaya and his 12 exhausted followers shelter in the darkest moment of their lives. Now he stood at the center of the kingdom they had built from that shelter. Wijaya married all 4 of Kertanegara's daughters on the same day, a pragmatic solution to the political problem of succession that Santa Murti himself had suggested. Any nobleman who married one of the princesses and claimed that his wife was the rightful heir would now be competing not against a pretender, but against the king himself, who had married all of them simultaneously. It was, like so many of Wijaya's decisions, elegant and ruthless in equal measure. On the 10th of November, 1293, Raden Wijaya was crowned the first Maharaja of Majapahit. He ruled under the name Kertahrajasa Jayawardhana. The forest settlement where a man had once bitten into a bitter fruit and spat it out became the capital of a kingdom. He would rule for 16 years. He would spend much of that time managing the ambitions of the very men who had helped him survive. Lawe, Nambi, Sora, and above all the scheming Viraraja, to whom he had drunkenly promised half his kingdom one night in Madura, and who now expected to collect. None of those stories are simple. None of them ended cleanly. That is the nature of kingdoms built on betrayal and survival. What came after was not a fairy tale. It was a dynasty. Raden Wijaya died in 1309. He never lived to see what the forest settlement would become. In the decades that followed, Majapahit grew from a forest clearing into a city of red brick walls and lotus ponds, of temple courts and busy river markets, of Buddhist monks and Shaivite priests living in adjacent compounds, of Chinese and Indian merchants keeping their counting houses along the Brantas. The most important festival of the year, according to the court poet, who would one day write it all down, ended with the entire population, from the highest nobles to the lowest servants, panting, vomiting, or bewildered from quantities of roast meat and palm wine that defied respectful description. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of empire that a man who had survived on coconuts and forest fruit while being hunted through river crossings would have wanted to build. But something else was also growing in those years. Something quieter, and in the long run, more consequential. Around the time of the Mongol invasion, perhaps a few years after, a boy was born in obscurity somewhere near Majapahit. His father may have been killed in the fighting. Nothing is recorded about his mother. What is recorded is his name, which translates without subtlety as rutting elephant. His name was Gajah Mahda. He would rise from a palace guard to become the most powerful minister this empire ever produced. And in 1331, standing before the Queen and the assembled court, he would make a vow that still echoes across Indonesia today. He would not eat spiced food. Not a single clove, not a grain of pepper, until every island of Nusantara, every kingdom from Sumatra to the far eastern seas had been brought under one roof. He meant it. And the story of how far he got and what it cost is a story for another time. What matters now is this. The empire that Raden Wijaya built in a bitter fruit forest in 1292 would shape the entire course of Southeast Asian history. The trade networks it controlled, the sea lanes it patrolled, the islands it brought, sometimes gently, sometimes not, into its orbit. All of it ran through the same narrow straits, past the same volcanic coastlines, under the same monsoon skies that had carried the Mongol fleet to its defeat. Those straits were not empty after the Mongols left. They were never empty. Ships were always moving through them, carrying pepper and sandalwood, cloves and nutmeg, gold and silk, and the quiet spread of new ideas. And somewhere in those seas, far to the east, there were islands where a single spice grew that the rest of the world had not yet learned to want badly enough. Not yet. But the ships were already out there, moving slowly, following the wind. And what they carried would, in time, bring a different kind of empire to these shores. One that would make the Mongol fleet look, by comparison, almost gentle.